Hey everybody, hope you're having a good week here in the second week of June. I wanted to put together a short video on our social trends page and look at some of the key queries that we can check out and see exactly how the crypto social crowd is reacting to what's going on right now. Obviously, May was a massively disappointing month with a huge drop off in the beginning of the month after the FOMC announced a inflation spike, and there were plenty of other, or I should say, an interest rate spike, that is, and there were plenty of other reasons for prices dropping, such as whales dumping, even prior to that. But now we're here in June, and things have recovered mildly. By far, it would be a stretch to say this has been a huge recovery month. Cardano has had its moments. Chainlink has had its moments, and even Ethereum is looking to be on a slow rise at the moment, but every time it does, it seems to get beaten down back to 1700 right now. Bitcoin is currently above 30K right now. But what we really want to see is while the market is kind of chopping, going up and down, what types of trends are arising that people are paying attention to? We obviously have a top 10 trending word countdown here that we can always check out and see words like YouTube and ads and premium. A lot of discussion related to the paid version of YouTube and the amount of ads and debates going on around that. Not a lot of crypto talk, interestingly. The word scam is always a concern when you see that. Huobi Exchange is in the news. There are a lot of things we can look into, and you can explore a lot of these subjects on your own. I don't want to get into specific news topics here on the video, but what I do want to get into are some of the major queries you can look at all the time and basically reference no matter what the markets are doing. And really, we would want to begin with an overall look at the total social volume that's going on in various crypto platforms between Telegram, Reddit, Twitter, Discord, and even some other pro traders chats that we have our API plugged into to see just how much overall discussion is going on. And we saw the biggest over the last 3 months here in late April before a big decline. This was right after a small rebound, by the way, so people were very optimistic. And we'll see a very interesting similar trend going on right now on the next chart I show. But as for the overall social trend, social volume on crypto platforms right now, it's mostly going back and forth. In the long term, if I go back to the last year, we can sometimes see that as prices go down, there's a clear drop in overall discussion as a lot of people basically drop out of crypto. But that has not happened at all. In fact, after the all-time high happened on November 8th or so, depending, maybe 9th, depending on where you are in the world, look at how social volume actually rose as people immediately started talking about the drop, and they were way more interested in the quote unquote cheap prices at 60K down to 50K and below, even though they weren't nearly as interested in the 50K to 60 range or 60K range or even the 40s. I mean, the social volume was nowhere near where it was after the all-time high happened and things started to drop. And really, other than a kind of a divot here in late February, this was around the time that the war was announced, if I'm not mistaken. It's been pretty much high throughout 2022. And this is very interesting to see, especially right here. This was a lot of speculation as to what the interest rates would look like going into the FOMC announcement that occurred here, that of course did not go well for the S&P 500 or crypto. But when we look at a chart like this, we want to see whether there is rising interest in the rising prices or dropping interest in the rising prices. And it's hard to really call this much of a rise. It's pretty minor compared to some of the, huger rises we saw at the end of last year. But it's something, and it doesn't appear to be getting much traction right now. So the moral of the story right now is not much. In fact, Since the bottom really hit around May 11th, May 12th, we've actually seen less and less discussion despite prices rising. And that can actually be a good thing, because if we see the mainstream start to really get interested, like we saw right here just after the prices started to drop, this was everyone basically saying it's time to buy the dip, right? The markets had been churning along for a year and a half, going back to March 2020 when the bottom hit after COVID hit. Um, and everyone basically figured that anytime an all-time high hit and there was a small dip, it meant that another all-time high was going to come, and everyone should be able to get in at a cheaper price. But very few people foresaw that we would actually be at a much cheaper price now, just above 30K, when here everyone was suddenly getting interested at the 63, 64K mark. So crazy to see the perspective on this. And there's a lot of mini stories throughout these social volume fluctuations that I can get into, but for time's sake, I won't. But what I will say is you can actually scroll down here and see how the social volume has varied based on the three major platforms, Telegram, Reddit, and Twitter. And obviously, all three have gone down. Twitter has been interesting, though. It did rise quite a bit before the big drop in early May, and after the big drop in early May, it's dropped just like the other two. But Reddit dropped pretty substantially over the past 3, 4 weeks, as did Telegram. Um, so that's something you can keep in mind no matter what you search for, whether it's just typing in an asterisk here on the social trends page, or looking at something else such as buy or buying or bought, and comparing that to sell or selling or sold. And you can put in several different, I don't know what the maximum is, I've never tried, but you can put in several different queries if you want. And I could just type in BTC, ETH, ADA, XRP. Actually, it looks like 5 is the limit. So there we go. I just learned for the first time what our limit was. But sometimes I'll have 3 or 4 different ones going on at the same time, just to see comparatively what's going on. And right now, the shared axis button is on. You can actually turn that off, and you'll be able to see each of these queries on their own low to high axis. So each one of these, you'll notice, has a high point on this chart: yellow, light blue, dark blue, brown, and whatever the other one was. I know it's here somewhere. Yeah, ADA was yellow. Yeah, they're all here. But you get it. The idea is shared axis off means you're basically comparing each of these versus themselves. And if you actually click this on, you're measuring their true social volume on the same axis as the ones you're comparing to. So something like buy, buying, or bought is usually going to dominate because there's a lot more bulls in crypto, or at least vocal bulls, than you see vocal bears. You're representing the light blue versus the red here. But let me turn these off really quick so we can look at just those two. So we see one major thing, and this is what I was alluding to on the last chart. The buy calls absolutely shot up off the charts earlier today. And I'm not quite clear on what the reason was, but this was the biggest surge in buy calls, and it was all by itself since the end of April. So around a 5 to 6 week high. And I'm curious as to what it was. I think if I take this off, since sells didn't really have any sort of craziness. Yeah. So now I can actually look at what it looks like on Telegram. Nothing crazy there. Nothing crazy on Reddit. But Twitter had a huge surge in buy calls. And it's very possible this wasn't directly related to crypto. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. But our algorithm is at least intended to focus on the crypto discussions and the handles that are related to crypto on Twitter. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's something major going on, or there was just some major excitement over a relatively minor jump up going from 30K to 31K or so for Bitcoin earlier today. But this is notable, and not for the good reason you would think. When the mainstream crowd suddenly gets bullish, which at least on the surface this would indicate, it usually means that there's a little too much euphoria going on, and prices are more likely to halt in their tracks after this spike happens. Now, it's possible when I zoom in that that spike is going to go away because of a lowered perspective. No, good. It's still very much there. So it did, when we really zoom in here and look at every 15 minutes, it does look like the initial consequence was a, a blessing, really. It actually pushed up the price as people were calling for buys, and they happened. But typically, the long-term ramifications of a lot of optimism from the crowd is more negative. It's short-term looking very good. People get excited and think that the crowd is about to pump up the price, and then a drop happens. And this is a relatively small rise and drop when we really zoom out, as you guys know. But it's something to keep in mind because we've seen this pattern several times over the years whenever there's a big euphoric buy spike versus a pessimistic sell spike. Trying to find a good example. I mean, this one was kind of a relatively minor one. This one, they actually semi-called. Actually, this is a pretty good example because a lot of people were calling for the dip way back here in June. Prices rose slightly, getting people excited and thinking they were right. And then boom, they get punished until the buy calls start to go away again. You can also switch it over to buy the dip instead, and that will give you kind of a better idea. Obviously, the big spikes around buy the dip are going to happen when there are dips, and sometimes there will be an immediate rise uh, and a continued rise, but more often than not, you'll see, like we just saw with the buy calls, spike and buy the dip, short-term rise followed by a longer-term dip. Now, yes, we did see another buy the dip right near the bottom here, and this was a legitimate one, but then it went back to a really big spike in buy the dip calls, short-term rise, longer-term fall. Another one here, very short-term rise, lower low made. Um, Same here. This one was pretty legitimate. People got it right on that one. So this is absolutely not foolproof. But just doing the eyeball test, and we would need to back test this, I'd say 3/4 of the time when you see a buy the dip spike, it means there's going to be a short-term rise followed by a longer-term fall until people become fearful again and don't want to buy that dip. Moving on, we can look at some of the major subjects that have impacted crypto over the last couple of years, or I should even say the last 6 to 12 months, really. And that would be inflation or FOMC or the S&P 500. We've got COVID or coronavirus. And then we have more recently Russia or Ukraine or war. And these were all, of course, major headlines that had real ramifications on crypto markets. A lot of people think that crypto is immune from what's happening in the real world. Maybe at one point it was more so. I would say it was never immune, but real news headlines and war and inflation and potential recessions, these are things that are very much impacting the markets now, especially with so many retail traders who are involved in both the S&P 500 and crypto, now involved pretty heavily in crypto, and are trying to buy the dip just like many of you. So we can see here there's pretty much been a drop in all of the subjects. We saw here, let's see, this was inflation. The biggest spike happened in mid-March when inflation was really starting to become a concern, and gas prices, at least here in the US, were starting to soar. Minor spike here. Then we had a huge spike in Russia or Ukraine or war in early May. The bigger one, if we zoomed out to the last 6 months, so you'll see that now it's dwarfing all these spikes because this is when the war was actually announced here on February 23rd and 24th. So you can see how that kind of had an immediate, it almost was like a, if we zoom in, I won't zoom in here, but I remember the big spike happened about the revolving around the awareness around the war. Prices then dropped, and then people started talking about it even more after the prices dropped, blaming it on the war, and they ended up being very wrong, that the war would suddenly be something that negatively impacts crypto, and it surged. And that's very often the case of kind of selling the rumor, buying the news, or buying the rumor and selling the news. Whatever the initial reaction is to a big news piece, it's a short term, crowd gets it right, and then for the long term, they get it way wrong. And then COVID, of course, is the longer term subject. Like if we go all the way back to, well, it's been more than 2 years now since the initial spike, but we can go to, let's go all the way back to 2019. Why not? So there we go. Let's just take off the other two just to show it by itself. So COVID is now represented by light blue here. We can see this is when crowd awareness got in. Prices dropped off a cliff. This was Black Thursday, and everyone thought it was going to be a long, long 2020 after COVID hit in terms of crypto prices. And it was another case where everyone was selling the rumor and then buying the news. In terms of, I shouldn't say everyone was doing that, but the ideal play should have been selling the rumor, buying the news. Another kind of wave here where Omicron hit in the end of 2021. And after that, COVID and coronavirus news or mentions have started to trickle way off as it's sort of become an accepted and hopefully diminishing, none of us can say for sure, but hopefully diminishing story in all of our lives. And then you can also, of course, look at Telegram, Reddit, Twitter for those. Moving on, we can also look at how Bitcoin mentions are doing versus altcoin mentions. Obviously, Bitcoin has gained in terms of price dominance lately, not so much in social dominance, but interestingly, I mean, we can still see that Bitcoin is dominating the discussion compared to altcoins. But if we take off shared access, we can look at the highs and the lows for both of them throughout the last 3 months. We can see that altcoins really started to get a lot of discussion as prices were bottoming out, interestingly. So a lot of people probably were looking for some altcoins to buy at a very low price, or they were just mentioning, more likely, they were just mentioning the fact that, we're looking at Bitcoin's price here, but altcoin prices were plummeting way, way, way lower than that. And so they were making some big headlines as liquidations were happening right and left. People were getting out of their remaining positions in altcoins, all sorts of crazy stuff. But yeah, as of now, Bitcoin is still dominating. Good thing to keep an eye on, though, as months progress, as you try to figure out what the crowd is becoming euphoric in. And then last but not least, we can also look at, NFTs and DeFi and gaming and just see what kind of industries within crypto are getting the most hype right now, as you'd expect in a what most people are calling a bear market. Prices or all mentions are sliding down a little bit. We did get a pretty relatively big gaming spike. If I take off shared access, this was the biggest spike here just recently. I'm curious as to what that was about. Couldn't tell you off the top of my head. DeFi has not been getting nearly as much traction, and that makes sense. I think DeFi is something that people are much more interested in during bull markets, where they just let their coins sit in a separate entity while gaining interest. And then NFTs are continuing to see their share in the spotlight and are really dominating the other two subjects, as we can see. So yeah, that's just a little quick tutorial on how you can look at various subjects on social trends. I should also mention the functionality of specific coins. So if I want to look at ETH, you'll notice how the price is still under BTC, but if I click here, it's going to automatically recognize that I probably want to look at Ethereum's price. So that is available for me in this dropdown. Sometimes it may not be as clear. If I just type Ethereum, it's already on. Pretend I hadn't just clicked on ETH and it isn't available yet. I would actually want to go into the URL, and you want to change two things. You want to change the slug to Ethereum, if I can type, and then the ticker here to ETH. And usually you won't have to do this, because as long as you type in the hashtag or cash tag, I should say, it'll pop up here 99% of the time. But in case that's not available, and we didn't already have ETH selected, it would now be showing ETH's price on the green line instead of Bitcoin's. So that's just a quick tip on that. Oh, also social dominance, by the way, which I didn't mention. You can click that on, and in addition to seeing the social volume, you can actually look at the percentage of discussions related to Ethereum and see if that might differ a little bit compared to ETH, because if there's a big social volume spike at midnight, when there isn't, or midnight Pacific time where I am at least, when crypto crowds are a little more dormant, uh, that might mean that there's an even bigger spike in social dominance because there isn't much discussion overall at that time of day. So that's an extra useful tool that you can have at your disposal. But that's it, guys. Hope this was helpful. I will talk to you in a few days for our This Week in Crypto call. Talk to you soon.